Hello, welcome everyone. Hi everyone, thank you so much for your patience. My name is Emma Grover, and I am the Program and Communications Coordinator here at the Oakland Asian Cultural Center. Today, we are so honored to have Haruka Sakaguchi and Henry Kaku presenting at our center today. As yesterday commemorated the signing of Executive Order 9066 on February 19th, 1942 by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And, Executive Order 9066 authorized the U.S. military to forcibly remove persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast and set into motion their incarceration into concentration camps during World War II. Today, we remember this painful history and extreme violation of civil rights, and we look at our country today and the continuation of rhetoric criminalizing our immigrant communities and communities of color. And I want to acknowledge a few organizations doing amazing work in this room. And so we have Sue for Solidarity, the Japanese American Pilgrimage Association, and Eastwind Books of Berkeley. So for those joining us online, Eastwind Books of Berkeley has an online bookstore you can support as well. And Henry, as you might have noticed, has graciously brought in important memorabilia related to his family's incarceration, which you can be found at the tables up front. And I'd also like to thank Andrew Kodama, Ashley Cousin, and Sisha Takagishi for helping bring this program together in its early stages. So now for our presenters. Haruka Sakaguchi is a Japanese documentary photographer based outside of New York City. So she flew in all this way for you all today. Yes. She was born in Osaka, Japan, and immigrated to the US with her parents when she was 3 months old. Haruka's documentary work focuses on cultural identity and intergenerational trauma. Her clients include the New York Times, National Geographic, Time Magazine, The New Yorker, among other publications. Henry Kaku is the Speakers Bureau Chair for the Sonoma County Japanese American Citizens League, or JACL. As we'll hear more about later, Henry's entire family was deported and sent to Japan after World War II. Although they were born in California, his family lost their U.S. citizenship during this time. It was not until 1956 that Henry became a U.S. citizen at 8 years old, and his family returned to California. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Haruka to the stage to introduce the Camps America Built.
Let's give a big round of applause to the Oakland Asian Cultural Center for hosting us today. And I know Emma had also acknowledged the two organizations back there, but I just wanted to highlight Yatsuru for Solidarity and Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages. They were, they played a pivotal role in shaping this project. I wanted to give a quick shout out to the founder of Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages, Kimiko Mar. She was my very first advisor on this project, and she not only invited me to my first pilgrimage and connected me with one of the first families that I had worked with, but she also really helped me kind of navigate this project as it evolved and understand kind of my ethical responsibilities of sharing this history as someone with no direct family ties to the camps, which I'll get into a little later in the presentation. I know Kimiko is over there. She's probably cringing as I'm doing this, calling her out in public, but I wanted to give her a quick shout out before we begin. That said, let's dive right in. Are you loyal to the United States? For some of you, the answer may be a resounding yes. You're loyal to the U.S. because you believe in its democratic ideals, because the U.S. is where you call home. For others, the answer may be a definite no. You don't consider yourself loyal to the U.S. because you don't support the current administration, or home is elsewhere, outside of the U.S. For the rest of you, the answer may be a mix of yes and no. Perhaps you consider the U.S. your home, but you don't support the current administration. Perhaps you believe in the U.S.'s democratic ideals, but you struggle with its fraught history. Perhaps you take issue with the wording of this question. What does it mean to be loyal to a government? How does one show their loyalty to a country? And can one be loyal and critical at the same time? Are you loyal to the United States? This painfully difficult and existential question was what Japanese Americans were faced with while incarcerated in camps during World War II. Many of us may have learned that following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt authorized the forced removal and incarceration of over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of whom were US citizens, into so-called internment camps. But few of us may be aware that several months later, the US government began looking for ways to release some of its incarcerees. After all, feeding and incarcerating over 120,000 people in remote areas could get pretty costly. So in 1943, they distributed a questionnaire to the incarceree population to determine who was loyal to the US government and therefore eligible for early release or potential military recruitment. This loyalty questionnaire was a multi-page document that had two especially controversial questions. Question 27, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? And question 28, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America? I'm going to skip ahead here. Forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor. These questions cause confusion within the incarceree population. Say you were a second-generation Japanese American who was born here in the US. You barely know who the Japanese emperor is, let alone have any allegiance to him. How do you forswear an allegiance that you never had? Would forswearing allegiance imply that you had an allegiance previously? Say you were a first-generation Japanese immigrant, not born here in the US. Remember, this was back when non-white immigrants were still barred from becoming naturalized US citizens. So you wonder, would forswearing allegiance to the Japanese emperor mean giving up your Japanese citizenship, the only citizenship you have? For some US-born incarcerees, answering yes meant risking being separated from your family members. Perhaps your first-generation parents answered no to these questions. Now what? Could answering yes lead to you being separated from your aging parents, forcing them to fend for themselves in the camps? For most incarcerees, US-born or not, these questions were deeply insulting. You put me behind barbed wire on suspicions of being a threat to this country, and now you want to know if I'm loyal to the same country? As you can imagine, many Japanese Americans answered no to these questions. Unfortunately, those who answered no or refused to answer these questions were labeled no-nos and sent to a maximum security camp called Tule Lake. In total, there were approximately 12,000 no-nos who were sent to Tule Lake, and many of these resistors were eventually deported to Japan after the war. The no-nos were stigmatized by the general public and even members of their own community for being, quote, traitors to the US government. I didn't learn about any of this until several years ago. As a first-generation immigrant from Japan, my knowledge of the camps was limited to what I'd learned in US history class. That Japanese Americans were displaced, but they persevered. That life inside the camps was lacking, but bearable. That even though they were far from home, incarcerated still had access to food, shelter, and even recreational areas where they cultivated gardens like this or played sports to pass the time. The photos that were presented in my class, they showed Japanese Americans dressed in their Sunday best as they were evicted from their homes, taking up hobbies as they adapted to life behind barbed wire, and leaving the camps with their dignity intact and eager to move on from this dark chapter in American history, eventually earning them the title of model minority. Well, after learning about the loyalty questionnaire and the no-nos in particular, I grew curious about what actually happened in the camps in the post-war years. And I quickly learned that this model minority image didn't quite cover the entire story. I learned that many of the photos made available from that time period, like the one you're seeing behind me here, they were actually staged photographs made by photographers commissioned by the War Relocation Authority, the federal agency that oversaw the camps. I learned that not all incarcerees were compliant, that there were Japanese Americans who actively resisted their incarceration and declined to serve a country that denied them of their rights and their dignity. I learned that Japanese Americans were still reeling from the traumatic events of their incarceration, like hearing stories about the suicides of their fellow incarcerees, and witnessing the FBI arrest their father and never living together as a family again. I learned that far from wanting to forget this dark chapter in American history, hundreds of Japanese American families have been returning to their former camps in the form of pilgrimages to remember what happened during the war. Here in the US, the story of Japanese American incarceration is often presented as this shameful product of wartime hysteria, a regrettable moment in history that is now behind us. But former incarcerees and descendants, they share a different reality. That the story of Japanese American incarceration is not a story of temporary victimhood, but a shared American legacy that holds a mirror up to who we are today. This is the impetus of my project, The Camps America Built, an educational website about the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. When I first began this project in 2022, I named it Kyampu, an American story. The word kyampu, which is camp in Japanese, it held cultural significance, and adding an American story was my way of reframing this history within a broader American context. But as I listened to Japanese American families share their stories over the past 2 years, it became increasingly clear that Japanese American incarceration isn't just a Japanese American story. It's part of a broader American tradition of exile and exclusion. In my lifetime alone, I have witnessed this pattern of incarceration resurface in many ways. After 9/11, Islamophobia led to the widespread surveillance and profiling of the Muslim community, where hundreds of Muslim men were detained in Guantanamo Bay without due process. I've witnessed it in the ongoing racial profiling and mass incarceration of Black Americans, fueled by discriminatory policing and sentencing laws that sustain a vast and profitable prison system. In the past month, the current administration has issued dozens of executive orders, including measures that have led to the incarceration of undocumented immigrants under the guise of protecting the American people against a so-called invasion. This isn't just history. It's an American legacy that continues to shape lives today. Recently, it was brought to my attention that there's another project called Kyampu, co-created by an organization that has long been at the forefront of preserving the history of Japanese American incarceration. Out of respect for their decades-long commitment to advocacy and scholarship, and to ensure clarity as my own work continues to evolve, I renamed my project The Camps America Built. One of the central themes of this project is the practice of pilgrimage. The word pilgrimage may imply a journey to a sacred place. But for this community, pilgrimage is a return to a site of trauma. Why revisit a place of deep humiliation and suffering? Some return to commemorate a family member, while others return to find healing and closure. Many find community and belonging by gathering together in these desolate landscapes. There are 10 camps total, scattered across the country. Some are carefully stewarded by local communities or the National Park Service. And others are more vulnerable to vandalism and neglect. Some are threatened by nearby developments, like the construction of a miles-long security fence at Tule Lake, or a 76,000-acre wind farm within viewshed of Minidoka. Former incarcerees and descendants are currently fighting to preserve the physical integrity of these sites. For my project, I have been photographing the camps as they stand today and the Japanese American families who journey back to them. Here's a trailer featuring Gregory and Midori Sampson, whom I had the privilege of joining on a pilgrimage to Tule Lake.
I was raised that this is a period of my family's life that we want to forget. Our family is like, we never really talked about a lot of stuff, personal stuff. I never knew my parents' birthday, or I never knew anything about their history, you know. I didn't even know how I fit in the family dynamic. All of my siblings all have this tendency to have secrets. And I think that's a lot of what my mom learned, to repress a lot of ideas or attitudes because it's going to get you in trouble. When we named our daughter Midori, my mom had a fit, just went on for a couple months about how this was going to be nothing but trouble for us with her name being Japanese, and why would you do that to her? And so, yeah, there's that feeling in there of that this could happen again.
So, as Greg shared with us, many Japanese American families chose not to speak about their incarceration after the war, in some cases to protect their children and their grandchildren from the stigma of their incarceration. Instead of asking families to break this protective silence, I've been asking them to handwrite a letter. For former incarcerees like Louise, right here, a letter to their child self when they were incarcerated. And for descendants like Andy, right here, a letter to the former incarceree and their family. This is the Ideno family, whom I had the opportunity to join on a pilgrimage to Rower in southeastern Arkansas. Survivor Kazuo Ideno, he sits here in the middle, joined by his daughter Karen on the right and his grandchildren Jacqueline and Blake on the left. Kazuo addressed his letter to his 2-year-old self when he and his family were displaced from their home in San Francisco and arrived in Rower. Here's an abridged version of his letter.
Dear young Kaz, you are not responsible for Japan starting World War II against the United States. Unfortunately, because you were only 2.5 years old when you were incarcerated, you developed a sense of guilt and shame during your formative years after leaving camp. You spent many years trying to prove you were a patriotic American, such as refusing to take Japanese language classes and legally adding an American first name.
And this is Kazuo's daughter Karen, who dedicated her letter to her father.
Dad, I can see the scars on your skin of the burns from the potbelly stove, a result of being a toddler in cramped quarters. The deeper scars of inferiority and shame are hidden inside your heart and mind. My heart cries when I think about this painful chapter you survived. You and Grandma were born here. 2 generations of Americans, yet somehow not considered American enough due to racial prejudice. It is our duty to make sure the legacy lives on through the generations, and this travesty never happens again.
These portraits are compiled into family profiles, where readers can learn about one family's history from multi-generational perspectives. As you saw right there, the family profile starts with a family photo at the former camp, followed by a portrait of the former incarceree. And as you scroll down the page, you meet their descendants. You can listen to each person reading out their letter by clicking the audio player underneath their portrait. Throughout the course of this project, I've had the privilege of photographing over 80 former incarcerees and descendants. These families, they've gently guided me as we explored the question, what does it mean to be American? Is it to be born here on American soil? Is it to be of a certain race? We live in a precarious time. The same policies that led to the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans 80 years ago are resurfacing under the guise of national security. History is once again repeating itself. It may be tempting to shake our heads in disgust, to disengage and quietly retreat into our private lives. I tried that. It may be easier to numb ourselves with distractions, to focus on self-preservation, to avoid feeling this constant despair. I tried that too. But if history has taught us anything, It's that the antidote to despair isn't silence, it's remembrance. That crippling anxiety you feel when you read the news, that's not weakness. It's proof that you're still paying attention. That heaviness in your chest when you think about the state of our country, that's not cynicism. It's evidence that you still care. That bone-deep exhaustion you feel when you think about what's happening in the world today, that's not helplessness. It's the weight of choosing to remember in a world that wants us to forget. The elders who have guided me through this project have reminded me time and time again that in moments of uncertainty, in fact, especially during moments of uncertainty, remembering is an act of resistance. One such elder is Henry Kaku, whom I had the privilege of meeting and photographing last summer. I joined Henry as he made a pilgrimage to Tule Lake, where his father, Keiji Kaku, was incarcerated after answering no on the loyalty questionnaire. Please join me in welcoming my dear friend, Henry.
Hello. It's amazing to see so many people here, and I'm honored to have been chosen to be filmed in this documentary that Haruka was working on. I've been giving talks to high school students for probably since the early 90s, and I've spoken to literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students. And in the beginning, I would just talk about what happened to the Japanese Americans during World War II, the generic information about the 120,000 plus individuals who were incarcerated, the suffering that they went through, the living conditions and all that. But about 15 years ago, I began to customize my talk and end the story with my family being deported. And the more I began talking about that, the more I learned that not only were the people I was talking to, mostly high school students and college students, that they wanted to know more, but they wanted to hear more about my story, about my family's story. And when I began talking to the Japanese American community, they also had heard about some Japanese Americans being deported, but knew very little. As mentioned earlier by Haruka, the people, the Sanseis, the third generation Japanese Americans growing up, my generation people, when I asked my friends when I was in college in the late 60s, early 70s, they said, oh, my mom and dad, they were in so-and-so camp. But that was all they said. What I also learned later on was that if they were in Tule Lake, their parents would not say that they were in Tule Lake. That they would say, oh, we were in camp, and that was about all. Because those who were in Tule Lake were stigmatized as disloyal, un-American. And so as I began talking more and more about my family story, I realized that we were a small portion of the 120,000 individuals who were incarcerated during the war. There were only less than 5,000 that were deported eventually at the end of the war, and their U.S. citizenship taken away. I grew up hearing this story. My father never stopped talking about this. In fact, every time the story or the World War II issue came up, he would just go on and on and on. And I would have to tell him, oh, shut up, Dad. We've heard that story already over and over. Now that he's gone, I'm sorry that I didn't ask more questions. But I was able to ask my grandmother as often as I can when she lived in Japan. So when she went back to Japan and I would go visit her, I would sit down with her and she would speak to me in Japanese, and I would try to understand about 1/4 of it and write down little notes. And then my auntie, who's now 92, she's still alive up in Oregon, she would write me letters. My father's cousin, who's in his late 90s, wrote me a number of letters about my father and my family. So I was very fortunate to learn about my family's story living in Japan, being deported, what my father did and why he did what he did, and why he was a no-no boy, and why he was considered disloyal. And so today, I talk about what happened because I want this story to be told, because I found that hardly anybody speaks about the no-no boys. And when they do, it's all academic information that you could now read in history books and books written by other people. So very few people were out there speaking, so I continue to do that, and that's why I do that. And so when people ask me, why in the heck do you do this? It's because I want people to know. And when I speak to high school students, I talk about the fact that we take history class so that we learn about history so that we don't repeat the bad things about history. But as Haruka mentioned, it's going on right now. So anyway, with that, that's why I agreed to do this film, and I'm really glad for Haruka for doing this. So thank you, and thank you all for being here and listening to and watching my short film. Thank you. Dear Pop, I'm writing this letter to you because there's many things that I wanted to say to you, but I never did. I never said to you, I love you, and thank you for taking care of me. We never spoke these words or showed any emotions with each other. I guess this was the Japanese way. For over 20 years, I've been giving presentations to high schools and college and community organizations about the Japanese American experience because I want to keep that story alive. But with my own family, I can't. My father's name was Keiji Kaku. He was born in 1915 in Arosa, California. He always felt that California was his home. Keiji was a very proud young man. He had just turned 25 and he wanted to serve in the Army. So he enlisted in 1941. And then when Pearl Harbor was attacked, his commanding officer said, Mr. Kaku, you need to leave. Even though he was born and raised in the United States and an American citizen, because he was ancestral of Japan, he was kicked out of the Army. And they were sent to internment camps, my father and my entire family. Often during dinner, when the subject of the camp came up, you would go on and on. I wish I was more empathetic with you and supported your anger. He walked into the internment camp wearing his uniform. And I think he probably put his chest out saying, look, you're pointing your rifle at me. I'm wearing the same uniform you are. He said, I was in your army and you kicked me out and then put me in this hellhole. In the camps, the War Relocation Authority forced incarcerated to take a so-called loyalty questionnaire, featuring 2 infamous questions. Question 27, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States? And question 28, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and forswear any allegiance to the Japanese emperor. If you refused to answer or answered no to either question, you became known as a no-no boy. My father, very angry, did not answer the question. If you were considered a no-no, then you were disloyal, traitor, and the entire family was included. And the no-no boys from the other prison camps were all transferred to Tule Lake. Refusing to answer the loyalty question must have taken a lot of courage. I tried putting myself in your position. Having volunteered to serve in the United States Army just to be kicked out and sent to prison. "80 years later, I visited Tule Lake. It's hard to believe so many people were held here. I didn't imagine that I would get emotional coming here. This is the place where my family was treated like traitors in our own country. My father was serving in the army. Then suddenly he's kicked out, locked up, and asked to prove his loyalty on a sheet of paper. The only way he felt he could hold on to his dignity was to renounce his citizenship. Your strength to stand up for your rights as an American shows you were not afraid of speaking the truth for your rights. I never said, 'I am so proud of you for doing this.' After Tule Lake, my family was deported to Japan. Now, I did hear many stories from my mother and father on the first few months of living in Japan. They were barely surviving because they had no food. In 1948, I was born in Japan. I was named Akira. From 1946 to 1955, we were stateless without a country. Then, a civil rights attorney helped my parents argue that they renounced their citizenship under duress. They won the appeal and got their citizenship back. So my father and mother were able to pay for a passage back home. When my parents came back from Japan, they said, "Akira needs an American name." Someone said, "Well, there's a candy called O. Henry." So without any legal name change, they said, "Akira, you are now Henry." And from now on, we only speak English. What does it mean to be a loyal American? To declare loyalty to the United States despite the way you are treated? Or to stand up for your rights as an American citizen? I wish I could tell my father, I now understand what he went through. As a father, you had to start your life over several times. Once when you were incarcerated, then when you were sent to Japan, and then to start all over again, coming back to the US. These words, thank you, I never said to you, I'm sorry. Your son, Henry. When I was very young, coming to America, I didn't have friends to play with after school. So I would come home, study my English, and then just sit and do origami. I've probably folded over 20,000 cranes in my lifetime. The cranes in Japanese history are almost like a prayer. If you make 1,000 cranes and you make a wish, your wish will come true. And I wish for people to know that this injustice did occur and to talk about it. I still find it difficult to talk about these things with my family. Part of me wants to protect my children from the dark parts of our history. But I want to keep this story alive because we, as Americans, can never let this happen again. I was going to say, one of my cousins who I grew up with in Japan, who was born in Japan just like me, is here in the audience. Mike?
Hello.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you want to give us a wave? Not to put you on the spot.
Where are you, Mike? Oh, there he is, back there.
Actually, can I ask if people are comfortable, how many of you are descendants of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated? Thank you so much for being here with us today. There's a lot to take in, and a lot of this is really heavy, but I think we can also learn a lot about this for today and how we should continue fighting. And so for Henry, I want to start off. This might seem apparent, but if you want to share a little bit, what was the emotional or psychological impact of incarceration on your family? And how did those experiences shape the advocacy and activism work you do today? I know you do a lot of that. It was like last week you had an itinerary for every single day. It's amazing how hard you are fighting. And so, yes, do you mind sharing?
Well, for me, I think having been born in Japan and growing up in Japan my first 8 years and then coming to this country without being able to speak one word of English, the impact of what happened to my family and which affected me was the fact that I came to this country without knowing one word of English. And when we got off the ship, back then we came on the ship, we didn't fly, 1956, all I remember my mother probably talking to me in Japanese saying, "We're not going to speak Japanese anymore. We're only going to speak English." So here I am, 8 years old, and for the first couple of years of my life in America, it's like a total blank. And it wasn't until I got married and my wife and we were talking about, well, what was it like for you when you were a kindergartner or first grade? And I thought about it and I said, you know what? To my wife, I have no idea. It's a total blank. And as I was getting older and growing up and learning, figuring this out, it was a psychological, trauma that I faced that I didn't realize until I was about 30 or 40 years old. but it was because of what happened during World War II to my family. And as I mentioned earlier, the reason why I do the activism that I do about talking about this is so that we could all learn from our history in this country and hope that it won't happen again. And if it does happen, I tell my high school students when I speak. Last week I spoke to 600 students in an auditorium. And I said, one person could make a difference by just speaking up to helping your neighbor. Even if you can't stop them being taken away by, for example, ICE, you could help their mother, their father, or their brothers and sisters by baking a cake, baking cookies, or going to their house and just saying, we're sorry. Just that little bit of action could help that one family. So little things could happen. And so that's what I tell the students, that even if we can't stop what's happening, we could make that life for that family or that individual a little bit easier.
Thank you so much, Henry. And that's so encouraging to hear, I think, especially in these situations where we feel like there is nothing we can do sometimes, or we might not know the right tools, but even those little acts of kindness and supporting the people in our community are so important. So thank you for modeling that and for continuing to do that. Yes, and so I want to pose a question for Haruka now. And so, you shared in the Camps America bill that the U.S. government had created this propaganda, essentially, portraying Japanese American incarceration as like a pleasant or comfortable experience through these staged photographs. And I'm wondering, how did it feel to return to these internment sites and photograph, all these Japanese American families on these pilgrimages, returning to these places of harm and pain, and taking those photos and capturing those moments, knowing that photography might have had a different meaning at the time. And so I just want to pose that to you.
Thank you for that question. Shortly after the war, the barracks and admin buildings and the physical features, the physical structures of the camp were quickly removed by the U.S. government. They were either sold, parceled out to local landowners, or just demolished very quickly. So when you first enter these former concentration camps, there aren't a lot of physical traces of what used to be there. Henry and I can attest to visiting Tule Lake last summer, and it's Tule Lake was the largest camp where there were over 18,000 incarcerees and I believe about 1,700 structures. But I think you and I could both agree that it's a blip off the freeway. If you didn't know what you were looking for, then you would easily miss it. What remains today is just a small monument, the concrete jail cell where we did a lot of the filming, a few building structures, and a few utility plants. So again, if you didn't have prior knowledge of the camps, then it would be very difficult to find them. And so to answer your question, Emma, entering these sites for the first time, I was already kind of privy to the photographic whitewashing of the camps, but I think stepping foot into these camps, it felt like I was witnessing a real physical whitewashing of the camps. And it was a really stark reminder that without the kind of rigorous attempts by advocacy organizations and by the Japanese American community, by former incarcerees and descendants to, like I was sharing earlier, to protect the physical integrity of these sites, that they will easily disappear within this generation. So one thing that, it was a decision that I made pretty early on in this project as a photographer. I think, I know there's a couple of photographers in the room here today too. We may be tempted to make these kind of close-up intimate portraits to really kind of tap into the emotional quotient of a story. But I felt that the landscape, what's left at these sites, what remains of these sites, was just as powerful as the portraits. So we made the decision to make wider portraits, more far portraits, and follow a very uniform format. so that we can let the individual and the landscape tell the story.
I want to say, until you've actually been to any of these incarceration camps, it's amazing how huge and vast it was. I've been to only two, Poston, where I went with my parents when they were alive. And there, you don't see anything but just desert, barren land. And when I was at Tudor Lake for the first time this past summer, just to see the area where the buildings were, I mean, how huge it is. It was just vast. When you see here 18,000, 19,000 people living there, you could just imagine how big it was, and then how desolate the area was.
Thank you so much for sharing, both of you. And to segue into the next question, this is for both of you, actually. So how has the legacy of Japanese American incarceration impacted different generations of Japanese Americans today? And does this history still impact younger generations?
Well, as someone with, again, no direct family ties to the camps, I think my interpretation is going to lean a little more on the academic side. So definitely, please take this with a grain of salt. And also, I hesitate to kind of paint this in broader strokes. But from my research and also from my conversations with the families that I had a privilege to work with, I have kind of seen that the incarceration had impacted different generations in very different ways. The first generation and second generation Japanese Americans, many of whom were adults while they were incarcerated. After the war, many of them prioritized things like survival and assimilation after the war, partly in order to protect their children and their grandchildren from experiencing the stigma and the shame and the humiliation that they had experienced during the war. And this sometimes came to a head with the Sansei, the third generation Japanese Americans. I think this really materialized during the redress movement when the third generation Japanese Americans prioritized things like justice and maybe reclaiming the narrative of Japanese American incarceration. Um, there was a 40-year campaign for justice after the war between the time when the last camp was closed and the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, when Japanese Americans were able to advocate and attain reparations for each surviving incarcerated, reparations of $20,000 and a formal apology from the sitting president. And, I had spoken to many family members who were talking about the kind of generational tensions during this 40-year period between the third generation Japanese Americans and the older first and second generation Japanese Americans about what redress means. What does reparations mean, right? On the one hand, we had to always remember the quote by a journalist and former incarcerated Bill Hosokawa, who had mentioned that, pushing for monetary compensation, it cheapens the sacrifice of the ordeal that we went through, which I think that's something that we could all understand. But at the same time, we had a full generation of descendants of the camps who were now forced to reconcile, the silence pervading the camps, but also pressures from their parents, right, to hyper assimilate, to outperform and outbelong their American peers. Shirley Ann Higuchi, she wrote a fantastic book called Setsugo's Secret, and she introduced this term Sansei effect, which had always kind of stuck with me, where Sansei means third generation, and as a third generation Japanese American, you're kind of set up to attain this impossible standard of outbelonging your American peers, but also being treated as a perpetual foreigner. And at the same time, being encouraged by your parents to really distance yourself from Japanese language and Japanese culture. So that was, something that many third generation Japanese Americans experienced. And the fourth and fifth generation Japanese Americans that I had the privilege of interviewing had also spoken about, also experiencing the same alienation and being treated as a perpetual foreigner. But now you have multiple generations of this kind of cultural unmooring of being distanced from the Japanese or Japanese culture and Japanese language. So now having to reconcile not having a cultural mainstay or any type of reference point, but in the same token, also feeling like a perpetual foreigner in this country. So yeah, those kind of were the broader strokes, the broader observations that that the families had shared with me.
The reparation in 1988, the years and years of Nisei's talking to the congressional committee that went all over the country to ask about the reparation and what they wanted. I think there was a lot of conflict even among the living Japanese Americans. Those who were alive, the Issei's, for the most part, they didn't want to bring up the past. They just wanted to forget about it. And I would think, and I'm just guessing, but I would say half of the Nisei's were that way as well. Most of the Nisei's who were the quote loyal, which were 90% of the Japanese Americans incarcerated, most of them said, let the past be past. Let's not bring up. But us Sanseis who were in our 30s, I don't know, I forgot how old I was, but we wanted to hear that. We wanted to see the reparation. We wanted to see the apology. And so there was a lot of conflict. And I'll tell you, when my father was going through all this when he was incarcerated, this is one of the things that I wanted to keep talking about, that my father was threatened when he first went into Poston, Arizona, in the prison camp, because he spoke up against what was happening. He says, I'm an American, I'm born here, and you put me in this prison. You took away my home, you took away all my property. I lost everything, my crop, everything. And he tried to get the other Niseis, the other young men in his 20s, to go along with him. And they all turned their back on my father. And they all threatened my father by saying, if you keep it up, we're going to beat the crap out of you. And this is what he went through for the first year and a half of being in prison. And then when he went to Tule Lake, he was again threatened by the other, quote, disloyal Americans, those who answered no. Because they said, well, Mr. Kaku, you were in the army, so you must be here as a traitor or as a spy, because you were once in the U.S. Army. So you're up here saying no, but not, you really don't mean it because you were in the military. And so he was threatened there at Tule Lake as well. So, for my father, I'll back up a little bit. Those who answered no to either question or refused to answer, there were as many reasons as there were people who said no, 12,000 people, okay? So, but for my father, it was because of him being treated the way he was by the American government, by the military. He wasn't against the American government, he was against the American military, and specifically his commanding officer for kicking him out. And then in prison, while incarcerated in the internment camps, he was angry at the other Niseis, the quote, loyal Americans. So, his anger got angrier. And so those who knew, and my cousins that are here in the audience, there's a couple of them, if they knew my father when we were all growing up, my father was, quote, angry. My wife will say that. Your dad was always angry. Well, that's because if you brought up the war experience, he was angry. Anyway, I'm going on. Sorry.
No,
I'll stop.
don't apologize, please. Thank you both for sharing, and I think it's just so heartbreaking to hear, especially as we talk about different generations and how they experience basically this violence that continues to follow the family as people are processing this trauma, as they're trying to heal. And I think it's so powerful that so many people here today have come with families, are descendants of Japanese Americans who are incarcerated, because this remembering is a part of healing. You know, we will not forget that this happened. And thank you both for being such key figures in bringing this history to light and sharing it with people. And so I have one more question for you guys, and then we're going to open up to Q&A. We're running a little bit short on time, and so this one is a really big question, but just going to, maybe we'll try and save some more time for Q&A if possible. But it's how do contemporary immigration policies and threats to civil rights echo the racial biases and justifications used for the incarceration of Japanese Americans? And, you know, what are some lessons we should remember when it comes to our civil liberties and continuing the fight to protect our civil rights today?
Because I speak to high school students almost every week in history and political science and even in English classes and everything, I always get one or two students come up to me who are maybe parents or grandparents are not here legally, even though they've been here 30, 40 years, and they're unable to get their citizenship. And they come up to me always at the end of the class and say, thank you for talking about this, because I'm afraid what happened to your family may happen to me, even though he may be born here in this country, that he and his family may be deported. So it resonates with a lot of people, those who are willing to tell me after I speak. So it's happening today, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think there's very stark parallels that we're seeing. This kind of framing of undocumented immigrants as criminals, as dangerous individuals. I think many Japanese American former incarcerees and descendants would recall a time when Japanese Americans were framed as potential saboteurs and spies within the US government, which was then used as justification to build concentration camps. Now we're seeing that manifesting in the form of ICE detention centers. This concept of birthright citizenship, right? Japanese Americans were incarcerated based on ancestry. There was emphasis on place of ancestry, not place of birth. And I think undocumented immigrants are now experiencing this in a similar format, where not only does it matter, the place of their birth, but we're now having these conversations about ending birthright citizenship altogether. I think we're seeing very stark parallels and very troubling parallels. But one thing that I had, learned through this project, of course, from what we were talking about, from what I'd shared in the presentation, that the elders have really guided me throughout this project. In these moments of uncertainty, and like Emma, you mentioned earlier, it is easy to fall into a place of kind of paralysis, fall into a place of despair. But whenever I was feeling down about this project, the elders had reminded me once again that remembering alone is an act of resistance.
Thank you so much. And I do want to leave some time for Q&A. And so, yes, we have two people with microphones who are walking around. And so,
hi, thank you so much for giving this talk today. Henry, I'd love to hear if you could share some stories about your mother's experiences in incarceration. Was she also angry like your father? And then I'd love to hear more about the thinking about writing the letters. I thought that was such a creative and really impactful way to get at the pain of incarceration. So I'd love to hear how that came about.
So to answer about my mother, that's one of my biggest regrets. When my father was 90 years old, 89 actually, I did a long interview with about 40 questions. And he obviously, without any hesitation, just went on and on. And I've got pages and pages of his answers to these questions. But when I asked my mother, she just says, no, I don't want to talk about it. She was your typical niece who did not want to talk about it. And, after she passed away, and even when she was alive, I wish I had asked her more questions directly. One of the things reason why she answered no was because she had just gotten married to my father when they were incarcerated. And so for her to answer yes to both questions, as her mother and father did, and her brothers and sisters, that would have meant that she would have been separated from my father. And my sister at that time was only a year old. And so, without hesitation, on my mother's part, she answered no and went along with my father so that she would not be separated. And, I look back at my mother. She was separated from her mother and father and her brothers and sisters for 15 years. 4 years while she was incarcerated, and then over 10 years living in Japan. So that must have been really hard for my mother. And, unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to talk to her.
And to answer your question about the letters, as Henry mentioned, and as many of the families had shared with me, many Japanese American families made a choice not to speak about their incarceration. Former incarcerees made this decision for many reasons, I'm sure, but partly to protect their children and their grandchildren from the stigma of their incarceration. And as someone who was documenting this history, I felt that there was a responsibility for me not to kind of come in and try to break this protective silence. And I was trying to find a way to figure out how to document the story in a non-extractive manner. And that was when I kind of looked back at my own kind of history with my own mother and how I'd communicated with my mother when I was growing up. And there were a lot of unspoken truth within my family as well. But when I had moved out, my mother had written me a letter. Up until this point, I had always thought that I was this kind of teenage daughter that she wasn't exactly proud of. But in this letter, she had shared with me that she truly loved me and she was proud of the woman that I already am and the woman that I was about to become. This was a moment of clarity for me, even though we didn't have many spoken exchanges, that this letter really encapsulated our relationship. So I think this was what kind of inspired this idea of asking the former incarcerees and descendants to write letters to each other. We also had, I had also shared that I don't have direct family ties to the camp, so it was also important that, we center the former incarceree and the descendants' voices without kind of imbuing my own camera work and emotions behind it. So that was what kind of led to this format of the wide portrait with the handwriting superimposed on top.
Thank you so much for being here and sharing your stories. I noticed that you, in some of the language on the screen, you said concentration camps or so-called internment camps. I think very carefully about words. I really like thinking about words and the power that they have. I'm curious about, this was the first time I think I'd ever heard the internment camps referred to as a concentration camp. I'm curious about your thinking behind that and whether there were any other words that you found you had to challenge in the course of this project. And then secondarily, do you have any advice for parsing the language that we hear now today about immigrant communities and how we can challenge that for ourselves in our own minds and in conversations around us? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Yeah. Would you like to?
Yeah, the term concentration camp and the term internment camp, relocation, it started out all by saying relocation centers. And, these were words that were brought up by the government, the US government brought up to soften what was happening to the Japanese Americans. Because in reality, it was a concentration camp. A concentration camp, by definition, means people of certain group are put into one prison center, and that's a concentration camp. Bosworth, the author of America's Concentration Camp, wrote the first book that I read that said America's Concentration Camp. But again, the Niseis and the Iseis did not want to use that word because it had a negative connotation. I think it was us younger people, the third generation, who said, no, we have to use the words that really what this really was. It wasn't a relocation center. It was an incarceration prison camps. But my parents they all said camps. So as many of the sanseis would say, us young people, we're all in the 70s, okay? We're not very young anymore. But, all of us growing up, we all thought, oh, our parents were in summer camp. In fact, one of my good friends just did a presentation last night that I went to hear, and she said, so you learned how to play koto, the Japanese instrument, in the camps. What a great summer camp you went to. And really, that isn't what they were at. They were not in camps. They were in prison camps, prison incarceration center. So we need to use the right words, incarceration or concentration camps. But it's very difficult because for 80 plus years, we've been saying camps.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't have much to add, but also the term internment is by definition the morally questionable, but the legal detention of enemy aliens during times of war. And this is one of the many euphemisms that Henry was referring to that doesn't accurately represent what was going on here, because 2/3 of those who were incarcerated were US-born citizens. Which is why terms like incarceration camp or concentration camp are the preferred terms. Another thing to note about the term concentration, well, I decided to use the term concentration camp for this particular project because by definition, concentration camp is the detention of a group of people without due process. And this, I felt, accurately represented. It wasn't like, Japanese American incarcerees were able to stand on trial in jury and go through a legal process to enter these camps. They were forcibly removed and incarcerated without due process, which is why I decided to use the term concentration camp.
And let me add, my grandfather and my father and my two uncles were in Bismarck, North Dakota at a POW camp for 1 whole year. So they were taken out of Tule Lake and sent to a POW camp. So that was incarceration. They were in prison with German and Italian officers. So my father was very proud that he made this box down here because he learned from a German officer how to do inlay woodwork. And so he made that and he brought it home, and my mother used it as a sewing box. I mean, her threads was in there until she passed away.
I think this will be the last question.
Haruka, Henry, you are both storytellers. You are telling a story about what happened. You're also telling a story about what's happening now. Thinking back about the documentation and how the story was being told when internment was happening, I'm thinking about, excuse me, Ansel Adams, Dorothea Lange, Toyo Miyatake. What is your thought around what they were doing then? Were they resisting? Were they, some of them, were they complicit? And do you have a thought about what they were doing with what they could at the time and what we all could be doing right now?
Well, you mentioned Dorothea Lange and Ansel Adams. They were hired by the WWII to take photographs. So as Haruka said, they were posed they were to smile. They were not allowed to take any pictures of anybody being sad and, depressed. So in fact, there's a story of Ansel Adams taking a picture of my good friend Hans Goto. He's here, right? Yes, his cousin, his two cousins, the two girls. They were very young, and because they didn't have a nice dress to wear when Ansel Adams wanted to take a picture, he ordered from catalog a dress for them, and then he took a picture of them wearing this brand new, beautiful dress. So they did that for hiring, but people like, what's her name? Dorothea Lange. She took a bunch of pictures, including Ansel Adams, of not so appropriate pictures. But when Ansel Adams tried to do a show in the 50s in New York, they were all blackened, and he was not allowed to show those pictures. Dorothea Lange's photographs were shut and closed for 70 years until they were allowed to be opened again or to be allowed to be seen. So, I don't know. So the pictures you see, the National Archives, are all those portraits that were staged.
I know I said that was the last question, but I did see a gentleman who I believe raised his hand when we asked if there were any people who were incarcerated. So I just want to say maybe we could hand him the mic if possible. Not to put you on the spot, but if you would like to say something, I just want to give you the opportunity.
As a teenager in Topaz during the war, I would like to say I appreciate both of you speaking this evening. You really drew a nice picture of what it was like as close as you can. Two things I would like to clarify. One is on the use of the term relocation and concentration. You have to remember the time that we were released from Topaz and other camps. When we returned to the community, people asked us, what was it like to be in camp? And because of our nature as Japanese, we soft-soaped it and used the term relocation, because as soon as you said concentration, you thought of Auschwitz and what happened in in Europe, and not to get involved in that and then to create a lot of fear. Most of us either didn't answer that or use the terminology camp or relocation center. The other thing that on that reparation, when that came out, and they talked to all us, the JACL and the other organizations, one of the things that we brought up about, we don't want the money. You can't pay us for the 3.5 years we were incarcerated. And then there was one person, a judge from back east, Nisei. He said, it's not the monetary amount. It could have been $1 or $10 or $1 million to every incarcerated Japanese. It wasn't so much that as it was, you have to let the American people know why the fact that we were incarcerated. And paying money is nothing. Once you pay it, people say they don't deserve it, but whether it was whatever amount it was. But if you put a sting to it, and the sting was reparation with the amount of money that the Americans had to pay to the Japanese Americans who were incarcerated. That was the taste that remained with them. So it was very important to know those two issues for those of us who were incarcerated.
Thank you so much for sharing. And just want to close this event out. And so could we give one warm round of applause for our presenters and speakers?